On your screen are RPGs I have played before encountering the Final Fantasy franchise. And here are some of the games I've played in my life before Final Fantasy. Quite the stark contrast, isn't it? Despite being a fundamental genre, my experience with RPGs was limited. In fact, the first time I've played a Final Fantasy game wasn't Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy X, or even the subject of this video. It was a WiiWare game by the name of Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles: My Life as a Dark Lord. As ridiculous as it sounds, this was my introduction to the franchise. A second to last game of a sub-series which isn't even a traditional RPG. It's a tower defense game that was positively received for attempting something different over the norm, even though it lacks depth. This attraction to finding different takes on genres isn't just a Final Fantasy thing. For most of my teenage years, I wanted to search for relatively different experiences I wouldn't find in traditional games I normally played. Not because I wanted to stand out from the crowd, but because I wanted to search for new takes in a genre. You can kind of see why I gravitated towards Final Fantasy XIII over the critically acclaimed titles in the franchise by now. Right? Final Fantasy XIII is the start of a brand new era for the long-running franchise, an era in which multiple games share the same universe named Fabula Nova Crystallis. This universe, for those who are curious, include titles like the Final Fantasy XIII games, Final Fantasy Type 0, and Final Fantasy XV. For this series of videos, we are looking over the 13 series of games: Final Fantasy XIII, Final Fantasy XIII-2, and Lightning Returns Final Fantasy XIII. It's a video series I've always wanted to take on for a very long time. A fair warning, this series will be spoiler heavy, so if you would rather play the games yourself, now's the time to click off from the video. Otherwise, for those who don't care about spoilers or who have completed the game, let's delve right in to the world of Final Fantasy XIII. Final Fantasy XIII was regarded as a different Final Fantasy game from both critics and fans of this massive franchise. One side of the spectrum praised its gameplay and presentation, while the other side despised the narrative approach and the strict linearity of the game world. After playing this game for over 70 hours, I can safely say that some of the criticism received are warranted, while others seem like they were blown out of proportion. Speaking personally, my experience with Final Fantasy so far amounts to all of 13-2, half of 7, bits of 9, and several chapters of 15. The viewpoints expressed will come from a person who isn't a franchise veteran, but someone who has played a handful of RPGs and a ton of non-RPGs. Whenever I do attempt to try out a brand new RPG, chances are I was attracted to the look of a game first than anything else. So, why don't we get started on Final Fantasy XIII's presentation? There are so many Final Fantasy games to try out. Which one should I play first? A game taking place in a traditional fantasy setting? A game that's somewhat futuristic? Or a game that attempts to rip off Stand By Me mixed with the Backstreet Boys? No thanks. I want to play a sci-fi Final Fantasy game where every single character dresses like they could be on the cover of a Louis Vuitton or GQ magazine. By the way, the former wasn't a joke. This is a real ad that the company put out in an attempt to appeal to the Japanese market in 2016. Anyway, the setting of Final Fantasy XIII is different compared to previous Final Fantasy games. Final Fantasy VII has a futuristic setting, but 13 is the furthest the series has been, with cybernetic creatures, airships, and a small detail from soldiers that imply magic is only possible through technology. This futuristic setting is translated well through its graphical prowess. In order to understand the majesty of Final Fantasy XIII's presentation, it's best to look back at games that were released around this time. While Final Fantasy XIII released in the West in March 2010, the Japanese market were able to play this game by December 2009, so I believe it's a fair assessment to compare 13 with games that released around this time. Grand Theft Auto IV attempted to inject realism into its game with towering skyscrapers in an open-world recreation of New York. The drawback was a limited color palette. Batman Arkham Asylum and Mass Effect One of the few earlier examples of utilizing Unreal Engine 3 has shown their age with disproportionate character models and stiff character animations. These games looked great back when they were new, but it's clear time wasn't on their side. Final Fantasy XIII's graphics, when considering other games released at that time, is impressive. The character modeling and animation work in gameplay looks great, while the cinematic models in the pre-rendered cutscenes are simply breathtaking. Hell, look at these physics on the characters! Look at these reflections on the floor! That looks good! If there was more effort put into the textures, lighting, and resolution, Final Fantasy XIII could pass for a PlayStation 4 launch title. The design of the environment when traversing across the floating continent of Cocoon and the savage world of Grand Pulse is varied, from ancient cities to a colorful amusement park, a futuristic city to a desolate wasteland. No two chapters look the same. Although, not everything is 100% perfectly crisp and eye-catching. Let's take the Sunlith waterscape level for example. When traveling across the linear pathway, the lighting, draw distance, and environment creates the illusion that this forest could go on for hundreds of miles. Once you stop and look at the ground textures closely, it's noticeably rough looking. Grand Pulse is where the game starts to open up with wide open fields and draw distances unlike any level before it. This unfortunately comes at the cost of consistent performance, where frames per second could take a dip in the 20s instead of a consistent 30 FPS. If there's one thing I can say Final Fantasy XIII excels at, aside from graphics, is the music. Composed by Masashi Hamauzu, this is his first project as a main composer in a mainline Final Fantasy game, who replaced longtime franchise composer Nobuo Uematsu. What Hamauzu brings to the table is no short of magnificent and memorable. The battle theme alone is enough to make me fall in love with the soundtrack. This was simply the appetizer, as other battle themes throughout the game were able to convey moments of importance, or filled players with intensity. Some of the other background music is well orchestrated as well, with my personal favorite going to Will to Fight. The only issue I have is the repetitiveness of certain tracks, particularly the use of the main theme of Final Fantasy XIII and the battle theme. I can't help but feel that the repetitiveness of these two melodies cheapens its relevance throughout the game, despite being enjoyable. As far as first impressions go when it comes to presentation, I was ready to dive in even further to the rest of the game. I mentioned this before in several videos. You can have games with graphics that rival against real life, but if the game isn't fun to play through, what's the point? A majority of Final Fantasy games rely on turn-based combat, and Final Fantasy XIII is one of the last single-player mainline games to have a mechanic similar to this once 15 made the transition to semi-action RPG mechanics. Turn-based Final Fantasy games after the original trilogy relied on a mechanic called Action Time Battle, where characters would wait for a meter to build up so they could perform actions. Final Fantasy XIII spins off this idea and adds something different. The ATB gauge is split into sections that represent the amount of actions a character can perform. On the surface, the game mostly consists of waiting around until characters can perform moves, but goes a little deeper than that. All enemy engagements start with running up to the enemy. Depending on how characters start the engagement, players can start the battle with an advantage. Though, I've had situations where whatever constitutes a preemptive strike is inconsistent. In Final Fantasy XIII, there are 6 different roles characters can fulfill: Commando, Ravager, Sentinel, Synergist, Saboteur, and Medic. Characters do have limited roles to fulfill at the start, but as the story progresses, all characters will gain access to all available roles. As a matter of fact, players can customize their loadout as they gain more roles. This is done through the paradigm menu. You can add roles, delete them, and even organize your party. This is the paradigm system. In any prior Final Fantasy game, or a majority of RPGs for that matter, characters have defined roles they fulfill, such as healers, fighters, and tanks. One can change it to any role that fits the player's needs. However, such changes would be done in a menu outside of combat. Final Fantasy XIII allows players to switch roles on the fly during enemy encounters. This allows for flexibility in strategy. If you want to build up the stagger meter faster against an opponent, I'd create a paradigm with 2 Ravagers and 1 Commando. If I want to have one character heal the party while the second character takes hits, and the third keeps the stagger meter in check, I'd form a paradigm with a Medic, a Sentinel, and a Commando. If I want to buff and keep my team alive and debuff the enemies, bring in a Synergist, a Medic, and a Saboteur. Any team is effective, but there are paradigms that are clearly better than others. By the time you reach the open world, you'll have an understanding of what strategies work on enemies. In any RPG, characters gain experience points by defeating enemies and allocating them into a skill tree, and gain new abilities. Final Fantasy XIII is no different, but the game makes it apparent what boosts characters will receive. In order to level up characters, players must invest their total crystal points into any of these roles. Each node you hit will net characters with HP, strength, and magic boosts, new abilities, and occasionally an extra ATB gauge or accessory slot. One would think, once the credits rolled, the game's over, but not Final Fantasy XIII. That's when the endgame truly starts. After beating the final boss, you're given a notification that the Crystalarium has expanded, meaning your characters can level up further. What do? What's there to beat? Well, players can continue the game by completing leftover missions or take on the Titans Challenge, a challenge where you battle enemies and follow a branching path. Depending on who you challenge, a final battle takes place between 6 different final bosses. If you're not prepared, be ready to die over and over. Which leads me to talk about some of the negatives I've experienced with this game. There are 2 missing components that previous Final Fantasy games had in the past: towns and interactivity. Something to notice as you're watching the footage, there seems to be little to no interactivity with the world and NPCs. Shops are replaced with this device that allows players to shop for items, craft and upgrade new accessories and weapons, and perform save functions. All dialogue with NPCs automatically happens as the character is walking past them. Everything that involves interactivity with the world, save for enemies and the occasional button press, feels static and lifeless. Usually, if an enemy sees a threat, they will start to attack the character dealing damage, but humorously enough, anything goes. If the character you control runs out of health, the game's over, but when your companions run out, they can be revived. It's an annoying feature that I really wish didn't happen, because it's silly to believe that one character makes or breaks the entire encounter. There were moments I had where I would attempt to keep my party members alive, only for an enemy to come and wreck the party leader. As mentioned before, there's the inconsistent nature of traversing areas or enemy engagements. Most encounters can be a challenge when encountering new types of enemies, but there's a consistent pattern that most players will fall under. Unknown enemy? Use Libra to analyze the enemy. That way, players can simply mash A because the auto ability option will select abilities suitable against the enemy, provided you're using the correct roles. With that said, using the same method against larger and tougher foes won't work. Take the Eidolons, for example. These beings can only be defeated a certain way. If you just mash A, expect to die by the enemy or through the timer. Once successful, the character can take control of the Eidolon, provided that the main party leader is equipped with it. Or at least it should be that way, unless players were to continuously grind and level up their characters to the point where encounters can last up to at least 5 seconds. This is true suffering from success, but these gameplay issues pale in comparison to the level design. Let me be clear about this. Linearity in RPGs is nothing new, nor is it a bad thing. many games of this genre have linear sections, mainly used to introduce players to the game's worlds and gameplay systems. Of all of the Final Fantasy games, however, the linear game design is made painfully clearer here than any other game in the franchise. Final Fantasy XIII's 20-hour linear segment makes Max Payne 3's 8-hour alleyway gameplay feel like an open-world game, and it's designed to be a linear game in the first place. Remember those beautiful areas I mentioned earlier? You only visit these areas in the game once. Once you complete a chapter of the story, there's no going back. Restrictive isn't a strong enough word to describe the linear nature of Final Fantasy XIII. The most ridiculous moment I had was during Chapter 9, where the characters are traversing outside of an airship. In prior chapters, the characters can leap across debris and jump great heights above obstacles in specially marked locations. In the airship chapter, particularly when traversing across scaffolding, there's a very small step the character is unable to jump across because it acts as an inaccessible boundary. Are you kidding me, Lightning? You can jump several feet off the ground, but can't jump over a small step? Yeah, just like that. You just did it! What, is it because the step didn't have an indicator on the ground that allows the player to jump? Look, game, there's linear, and then there's restrictive. Take a wild guess where you belong. Some of these design choices can be partly blamed for the platform it was originally designed for. While the game was in development since 2004, right after the release of the final version of Final Fantasy X-2, it didn't really take the shape people are familiar with until the PlayStation 3 technical demo of Final Fantasy VII in 2005. Yes, that far back. This is the foundation of what Final Fantasy XIII builds upon. The game was in development originally for the PlayStation 2, but because of the positive reception of the tech demo, the project shifted to the next generation console. Most of the work done for the PlayStation 2 version was kept, such as gameplay, story, characters, and level design. The only features that were updated were the graphics and facial capture of the characters. So when people say this next-gen game plays like a last-gen game, they're not far from the truth. As an aside, it's interesting how an insult like this could carry over into today's gaming landscape. I have a theory to why this linearity is present for what feels like 2/3 of the game, but I'm gonna save it for the next section of this video. While I'm talking about a game that is currently more than 10 years old at this point, I want to make an argument that playing through a strictly linear RPG today has become a breath of fresh air. Let me explain before you pull the trigger. I'm not saying that the entire experience Final Fantasy XIII provides should be replicated. In an era where open world games and live service games like Fallout, Assassin's Creed, Grand Theft Auto, Anthem, Marvel's Avengers, Fortnite, and even Square Enix's own Final Fantasy XV are saturating the gaming landscape, playing Final Fantasy XIII today serves as a reminder of what was lost back then. A clear endpoint. Far too many modern games rely on content downloads and a consistent player base that certain games who have neither will be forgotten and eventually shut down. I'm getting ahead of myself, but Final Fantasy XV had content downloads as well. He even started having a second season of content, but the director of the game, Hajime Tabata, left Square Enix in 2018, leaving 3 out of the 4 story DLC cancelled. Final Fantasy XIII is not one of those games, and I'm starting to mix experiences like this. Okay, so far, the graphics are pretty, and the gameplay has some faults, but it can be fun. Nothing that warrants pitchforks and torches in my opinion. However, if there's one major gripe I have with the game, it's its approach to its narrative. All of the mainline Final Fantasy games are self-contained in their own stories and mythos. There may be some references and recurring elements and characters, but for the most part, the stories of Final Fantasy games center around a different group living in a different part of their world. The Fabula Nova Crystallis series is a universe that ties together a collection of games using a mythos that attempts to be a recurring element rather than a connected narrative that ties together characters from their respective games. Final Fantasy VII was the first to have multiple media projects centered around its universe that expands the game's lore, but the Fabula Nova Crystallis series is the first to my knowledge that attempts to create and carry over a recurring element of this magnitude into other games like Type 0 and Final Fantasy XV, with the latter dropping from the series. According to the game's director, Hajime Tabata, the decision was for branding purposes in order to create a Final Fantasy game for fans and first-timers. But I believe the developers wanted to distance themselves from 13's failures. The mythos itself can be confusing at first, since the game is using terms only familiar to the inhabitants of the game. The layman's version of these terms goes like this. fal'Cie are godlike beings that are responsible for the creation and maintenance of humanity. l'Cie are usually humans who are chosen by the fal'Cie who are tasked to complete a focus, an objective they must complete before a certain time limit, which is dependent on the difficulty of the task and the l'Cie state of mind. They are given brands on their person that lets them harness magic. If they fail to complete their focus, they will be turned into mindless beings known as C's. If they manage to complete it, they will turn into crystal and be blessed with eternal life, according to the game's lore. All of the terminology and mythology of the game's universe can be found in the data log menu within the game. While I prefer the game just tell me how everything works through cutscenes, this is better than exiting the game and looking up the lore through an external source. The general synopsis goes like this. 6 individuals, well, technically 5 because the last one joins the party late, are intertwined by fate after a mass purge was enacted by the government of Cocoon. Branded by the fal'Cie and seeing a vague vision of Ragnarok and the fall of Cocoon, the group must figure out what their focus is and attempt to defy their fate given by the gods. It's a story with an interesting concept of defying one's fate and attempting to forge a new one, a concept that the developers will revisit a decade later. Here's my problem. Nearly everything surrounding the premise is done poorly. To say that Final Fantasy XIII has pacing issues is an understatement. As mentioned before, this game has a strictly linear level design that goes on for over 20 hours. In that time, the story structure isn't balanced out compared to other games in the series. The presentation and gameplay makes up for the story's faults, but by the 10-hour mark, I was nearly bored to tears. Final Fantasy VII has a linear section, but only takes up at most a third of the game's runtime, while the rest of the game has the player explore the open world. Final Fantasy XIII's linear section takes up 2/3 of its runtime. Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't the point of a sequel to expand what made prior titles great? Why is the player subjected to linear corridor levels and little to no interactivity with the world? Obviously, this is a brand new world with a new setting and new characters, but as a sequel, it feels like a step backward from world building as most of the supplementary information is tucked away in a menu instead of illustrated through cutscenes. A story is as strong as its characters. Since this is an RPG, players can expect to spend at least 60 hours with Lightning, Snow, Vanille, Sazh, Hope, and Fang. So, let's get started with Vanille. Much like others who played through Final Fantasy XIII for the first time, my first impression of Vanille wasn't a kind one, to put it nicely. She appears to be very outgoing, too cheerful about the group's grim situation, all things considered. And I'm going to be brutally honest here, I think she was created for the sole purpose of being a character for fans to fawn over. Look at the way she's dressed. Look at the placement of her brand compared to others. And for God's sake, what is up with that voice? After replaying the game again for the video, I think I misjudged her. If anything, she's one of the best characters in the game next to Sazh and Fang. On the surface, Vanille is a happy-go-lucky girl who attempts to have a positive outlook in life even when other characters around her seem to have lost their way. As the game progresses, players learn about her backstory and the reason behind her carefree attitude. This is the case for some of the other characters in the game. Sazh is an air pilot who wants to rescue his son from crystal stasis, find the person responsible, and bring them to justice. Meanwhile, Fang is an inhabitant of Grand Pulse who woke from crystal stasis along with Vanille and will do anything in her power to protect her. Now, we can't talk about characters without mentioning Tetsuya Nomura's favorite girl, Lightning Farron. Okay, the way I put it makes it seem like I was making fun of him and the character, but admittedly, I was smitten with her design the first time I laid my eyes on her. She appears to be tough, capable, and isn't the type that wouldn't tolerate anyone's BS. I have nothing against strong women. These are my favorite strong female characters in other games, and Lightning feels right at home on this list. And then I listened to her talk.
What are you doing trying to stop the purge? Why don't you tell me that?
I was a soldier.
Hey!
Once we're home, what's your plan? You're getting married, right?
What's that?
Sarah wants to know. This is ridiculous. Worst birthday ever.
Worst birthday ever. The dialogue almost sounds like a 5th grader's idea of a badass character, almost like a carbon copy of Cloud from Final Fantasy VII. In fact, it would not surprise me if that was the intention all this time. What Cloud has that Lightning doesn't have, other than the obvious, is a personality. Lightning is about as interesting as a goldfish in comparison to some of the aforementioned badass female characters. I don't fault the voice actress for working with the material she has, but her emotional range is 10% happiness and 90% is a mix of anger, sadness, and irritation. What about the rest of the major characters like Snow and Hope? Unfortunately, they're no better than Lightning. Snow is a leader of a resistance group who wants to rescue his fiancée no matter what, and Hope is a boy who lost his mother during the Purge, believing that Snow killed her. These two characters share an overarching side story about revenge, and quite frankly, I didn't care that much about it. The characters' personalities are what put me off from them. Snow is ambitious, but very hard-headed. He would risk everything for his fiancée, even if it meant he would sacrifice himself to get her back safely. Dude, do you know how many girls would kill for a guy like that? I understand that his heart is in the right place, but most of his decision-making would result in putting himself and others in peril, including Hope's mother. If he was a more competent leader, this side story would never happen. Hope wouldn't learn a damn thing, and the rest of the group wouldn't grow as characters. All there would be is the main story, Snow and Lightning's attempt to rescue Sarah, Saz's mission to rescue his son, and Fang's search for Vanille. What's there for Hope? His role in this side story is to be the one to take vengeance against Snow for allegedly killing his mother. Most of his dialogue and character growth can be summed up to this. I lost my mother. Shut up and smile. Okay. How can I stand up and get Snow? Shut up and grow some balls. Okay. I will have my revenge. Shut up and do it. I know I deserve it. I don't want revenge anymore. Okay. Look, Hope isn't the worst written character I have had the displeasure of dealing with, but his story arc doesn't feel essential, as others make it out to be. His personality is nothing but brooding, mourning, and the occasional whining. In fairness to Hope's character, he's a kid who's going through a terrible loss, one that pushes him in a state of confusion and anger. Losing someone he held dear would drive anyone to make rash decisions. All of the characters in this game are hit or miss, but I wouldn't change them. Believe me, cherish the feelings the characters are expressing now, because you'll start to miss them by the third game.
Is that all God can do? He can stop the flow of time up here, but he's helpless to prevent the world from being destroyed.
Yes.
I personally don't include fan theories to videos like this, mainly because I see them as fan interpretations of what things could represent rather than taking them for what they really are. But I believe this one in particular deserves some recognition, not because it excuses the game design choices, but it sounds plausible given the recurring themes. The theme of the game plays around the idea of a predetermined prophecy versus freedom of choice. This idea of fate can be seen and felt for the approximately 20 hours of playtime players go through. Long stretches of hallways and corridor-like level design could represent the characters traversing to a predetermined fate, an ultimate end goal with no way out. There's no other way to go but forward. By the time the group defeats Barthandelus and reaches for Grand Pulse, that restraint is loosened, which could represent the party being free from the shackles of destiny. However, I would say that hints of this freedom can be felt in the beginning of the 10th chapter. Remember that time when traversing the airship was ridiculously restrictive? When you start the next chapter, the player is free to talk to the group and explore the subway, if only for a little bit. The character can jump between platforms now! It doesn't seem like a big deal, but after 20 hours of restrictions, I felt like my soul came back to my body. One could argue this theory was concocted so fans could justify their purchase and validate their positive experiences, but intentional or not, this theory holds some water based on what was set up. In the end, the entire story of Final Fantasy XIII, save for some of the characters and mythos, starts to fall apart when viewed under an analytical lens. There's a comment I've seen pop up commonly in reviews from fans of this game as I was researching for this video. Final Fantasy XIII is a great game, just not a good Final Fantasy game. For fans of the mainline series, it's a departure of what made the franchise so special. For others, it's a great game that is worthy of the Final Fantasy name. My question to the audience is this: would you still love Final Fantasy XIII if this wasn't a Final Fantasy game? If characters like Lightning, the linear nature of the game, and the mythos were not associated with the Final Fantasy brand? If we were to take the Final Fantasy name away from 13, all we're left with is a flawed game with interesting concepts. Most of the criticism received from media outlets and longtime fans were rightfully deserved. The first 2/3 of the game can get mind-numbingly long and boring. Some of the characters can get under anyone's nerves, and the level design is the most linear for an RPG, or any game for that matter, I've personally played. When some notes missed the mark, they missed hard. but when the notes hit, they hit it just right. The gameplay is classic Final Fantasy with a twist. The combat allows for experimentation and creative freedom, and the overall presentation and attention to detail rivals even some 8th generation games. From experience, I have only played a handful of RPGs in comparison to the colossal amount of other games before Final Fantasy. Even then, my introduction to the franchise wasn't a mainline title, but a spin-off of a spin-off whose reception was generally positive for attempting something new even if the ideas presented don't fully come together. Just like this game. Final Fantasy XIII is by no means a great Final Fantasy game in comparison to other games released before and after. But I'm lying if I said I didn't enjoy it. It didn't matter to me whether encounters were inconsistent, the world behaving like a straight line, or characters making idiotic decisions. There's a lot to love and hate about Final Fantasy XIII, but for someone like myself, who has spent over 70 hours taking in the sights, understanding the gameplay, and getting to know and love the characters, I wouldn't mind replaying and reliving what Final Fantasy XIII offers all over again.